coming out of the recession a decade ago, we were gaining, as we recovered, 75,000 jobs a year, about. That slowed down substantially in 2017 and 2018. And then this year, so far, essentially zero job growth.
That's the voice of Charles Ballard, an economics professor at Michigan State University. And this is your Daily Detroit for Tuesday, September 24th, 2019. I'm Jer Stays.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. Is Michigan on the verge of recession? That's increasingly possible amid two storylines playing out simultaneously. One is the UAW strike against General Motors, which is dragging on without an agreement into its second week. The other is the possibility of a state government shutdown if GOP lawmakers and Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer don't enact a new budget by October 1st.
Sven spoke with Ballard, an expert who has written extensively on Michigan's economy, and he offered some troubling observations about Michigan's economic prospects. Then, we'll offer some of our own thoughts. But first, thanks to our members on Patreon that make this show possible. We believe part of having fiercely independent media is that it gets at least some of its funding from the people. So join us in pushing Detroit's conversation forward and become a member at patreon.com/dailydetroit. That's patreon.com/dailydetroit. And thank you.
Joining us to talk all about the economic ramifications of the ongoing strike is Charles Ballard. He's a professor of economics up at Michigan State University, and he's written extensively about Michigan's economy. Professor Ballard, welcome to Daily Detroit.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, so we're in the second week now of the UAW-GM strike. No agreement in place. We've seen reports of suppliers starting to institute temporary layoffs since the GM plants are, there's no production there and they're no longer accepting deliveries of parts. So far, how big of a blow has this been to Michigan's economy?
So far, I would say that it's a modest blow. Certainly, if you're one of the affected workers, if you've been laid off by one of the parts suppliers, or if you're on strike pay, your income's down. You can probably still afford to buy the essentials, but certainly your spending on non-essentials is going to be cut back, way back. And then there are the ripple effects. That means that the stores that used to rely on your business are having less traffic. And then for GM itself, I've seen a wide variety of estimates of how much they are losing per day as a result of the strike. They are cushioned somewhat by the fact that they built up substantial inventories in anticipation of the strike, but still, they're suffering losses. But I think that now that we're still less than 2 weeks into the strike, I think that the overall damage to the Michigan economy is modest. But I think it's every day it gets worse. And eventually, I think that the curve of how much damage it does, I think that curve is going to get steeper because you'll get to a point where it's really biting if it goes on long enough. And that's why I hope that we can reach an agreement.
Moody's and LendingTree have both said that Michigan is at risk of going into a recession. And of course, the tea leaves have been pretty ominous in general about the auto industry lately, right? Sales are slowing across the globe. We've got the ongoing trade war with China, over tariffs and everything, taking a chunk out of sales. How does that whole storyline factor into these labor negotiations?
Well, the Michigan economy has not been doing gangbusters lately. The auto industry generally has been flat. Sales plummeted in 2009 and then slowly recovered to about 17 million units, and they've been stuck there for several years now. So the auto sector sales are flat. And then in the Michigan economy, one of the things that I find most concerning is coming out of the recession a decade ago, we were gaining, as we recovered, 75,000 jobs a year, about. That slowed down substantially in 2017 and 2018. And then this year, so far, essentially zero job growth. We're up. The August report puts employment 3,500 jobs statewide higher than it was in January. And if you think about the sampling error associated with that, that's no change. If you're beginning at a place where the employment has been flat for more than half of a year, and then you add the GM strike on top of that, that's not a piece of good news.
No. You mentioned the recession of a decade ago. That also, of course, included the bankruptcies of GM and Chrysler. And Ford didn't go through bankruptcy, but they're a lot smaller too, like the other two automakers, than they were before the Great Recession. So does that soften the blow to Michigan at all? I mean, the fact that, the auto industry is not as big as it used to be?
It softens the blow a little bit, but the auto industry is still very, very important to Michigan. Going back to the 60s, autos, motor vehicles and parts, by itself was a quarter of our economy, whereas for the U.S. as a whole at that time it was 2 or 2.5% of the entire U.S. economy. Well, now both of those numbers have shrunk. U.S. nationwide, autos is less than 1% of the economy, but in Michigan it's 8%. Okay, so 8% down from 25%. It isn't as dominant as it once was, but 8% is still a big number, especially when there are spillovers, when there are, 8% is just motor vehicles and parts, but there are all sorts of things in Michigan that wouldn't be there if it weren't that they were somehow connected with the auto industry, various, metals and machinery and lots of other things. Bad news for the auto industry isn't as devastating as it was, say, in the deep downturn of 1982. But the auto industry is still important to us. There's just no question about it.
Right, and that begs the question. I mean, if the auto industry has gone in that time from 25% of the state's economy to 8%, what about the rest of the economy? Has it grown, more robust, or is it simply that the whole pie has sort of shrunk over time?
The whole pie has grown, but it hasn't grown as fast as in the rest of the country. And so Michigan, over the last half century or so, has gone from being an above average state to a below average income state. In recent years, our per capita income is about 11% below the national average. And we used to be a high income state relatively. So other things have grown, and those have made up part of the losses associated with the shrinkage of manufacturing, but not all. Overall, the last few decades have been not nearly as good for Michigan as we might hope. But one other thing to say about that is that, okay, so overall our economy has grown, but not as rapidly as some other places. But then where does that growth go? Who gets it? And Michigan is much like the United States as a whole in that in the last 40 years, most of the income gains have gone to a relatively small number of folks at or near the top. CEOs, financiers, doctors, attorneys, and lots of scientists, engineers have done quite well. The average worker, not that good. So that's when you combine slow growth with increasing inequality, it's not a really pretty picture, at least not from my perspective.
Yeah. Okay, so meanwhile, up there in Lansing, or up in your neck of the woods, state lawmakers and the governor are really coming down to the wire negotiating on the state budget. They need to enact a new budget before the new fiscal year starts 1 week from today on October 1st. Is this a perfect storm brewing if government shuts down and the GM UAW impasse is still ongoing?
Well, if we do have a shutdown, and especially if it's protracted, that would be a perfect storm, and especially for the Lansing area, because so many of the state workers are here, although there are a lot of them in various other places around the state. I don't think we will have a protracted government shutdown. In fact, I think there's a decent chance that we will avoid a government shutdown entirely, although check back with me in a week. We'll know next week whether it was possible to avoid a shutdown. Historically, shutdowns, we had some back in the first decade of this century when Jennifer Granholm was the Democratic governor and we had Republican legislature. Those shutdowns were very short. They didn't last long. And as long as one doesn't last very long, it won't do much damage. So if we avoid it entirely, or if it's short, doesn't do a great deal of damage. If, and I don't think this is going to happen, but it could, if we have a protracted shutdown, that of course would just add to the damage by a great deal.
Okay, so looking on the optimistic side, if the UAW and GM, can strike a deal, get it ratified soon, and the lawmakers and Governor Whitmer, manage to keep the government open and approve a new budget, is crisis averted, or will there be residual damage economically?
I think there will be some damage. It takes you a while to get back to where you were after a strike. Again, if the strike can be settled soon, the shorter it is, the better it is in terms of getting back to where we were. So that's very much what I'm hoping for, that this strike can be settled reasonably soon. I don't know whether that will happen. Certainly, if you read, I've read a lot of stories where workers are quoted, and it sounds like they're prepared to dig in their heels if they don't get some substantial concessions from the company. So it could last for a while. But if it is resolved relatively soon, we will have dodged a large bullet. On the other hand, some of the fundamental long-term structural things that we've been talking about, increasing income inequality, that's not going to go away. That will continue. That's likely to continue. And the fact that we still have a population, a workforce that is less well-educated than the national average, that's a long-term problem. So we'll solve all of our problems if we get this strike fixed, but it'll sure be a good thing.
So as you're reading all these materials and divining the tea leaves, as all economists surely do, how optimistic are you that we'll avoid going into recession?
I'm kind of 50-50. I think that there is a decent chance of a recession in the next year or two. There are just a lot of headwinds. I think the biggest one is the trade challenges, especially with China, but also other trade disputes. If those could be resolved, that would take away a headwind. But the global economy has been slowing. Germany's economy shrank in the second quarter. China's economy has been slowing down. The U.S. economy has been slowing down. On the plus side, this economic expansion that we are now in, and which is, at least for now, still going on, it has lasted 10 years and 3 months. It's the longest expansion in U.S. economic history, and that is great news. I don't think that we're now at a point where we can outlaw recessions. I think the next recession will come eventually. The only question is when. 3 years ago, nobody was saying, hey, there could be a recession in the next year or two. Now, lots of economists look at various things in the bond market, various other indicators, flat manufacturing sector, and they say that we could have a recession in the next year. But I'll be honest with you, I don't know for sure. In fact, here's how I don't know for sure, because if I knew for sure, I would be able to trade on that knowledge and I'd be a billionaire, and I'm not a billionaire, so there you are.
All right. Charles Ballard teaches economics at Michigan State University. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor.
Thanks very much. It was a pleasure.
Good conversation. You and I talk all the time about how we see a lot of softness in Michigan's economy from where we sit.
For sure.
It's good, if not depressing, to hear it reinforced by an expert.
It's definitely depressing, but I think it definitely reinforces a lot of what we see and experience. That look, you keep hearing national leaders talking about how robust the economy is. I don't really feel it, at least here in Detroit. I mean, we're starting to see, let's not forget, starting to see some projects slowing down. Dan Gilbert's Hudson site tower is downsizing and everything. What I thought was really fascinating was Ballard's commentary about the job growth slowdown here in Michigan since 2017. That I had not read that before. That's fascinating.
And to take a page out of Kai Risdal's book over at Marketplace, the stock market is not the economy.
Right.
And I think a lot of times people think they're the same thing. They're not really that connected whatsoever. And I think in Ballard's interview, it was interesting to see how that money has not gone to most workers' pockets. It's gone to a very small sliver, and it's gone to the top.
Well, it's gone to the investor class. Yeah.
Right. The investor class. And that's happened across the country, but also strongly has happened here.
Although, raises hands. I've got my retirement account tied up in mutual funds and the stock market and so forth.
for sure. I also want to talk for a second about this impending state shutdown if it happens. And I don't know if it will, but it's something that we're getting close to the line now. We're approaching it day by day. And looking at this world where, remember the mess we had last year about road construction projects coming to a halt when that 696 project got hit by that strike, and then it just wasn't finished right. They were messing with it into the wintertime.
Winter when it's not ideal weather to do, fix roadways and everything. Yeah, absolutely.
So that could happen again statewide, as all road construction projects would come to a halt with a shutdown.
Wouldn't that be a joy?
And then state parks would close. You'd lose your welcome centers and rest areas.
So you couldn't find, if you're in a long stretch of road where there's no towns to exit and you need to go, you're going to be out of luck. Well, that'll make people. I mean, if nothing else makes people angry, that will.
It's those direct things. And another thing that would make people angry, even though the lines are ridiculously long right now in a lot of places, the Secretary of State offices. If I had to renew my license in the next, if it was up in the next month or two, in the next month, I would just go ahead and go now to get that done. And just in case, because you don't want to be sitting there. I don't know if they would I don't know how that would work if they would give grace, but I feel like I would want to get that just done out.
Yeah, two other things that seem to me very alarming and cause for getting this done sooner than later. Three other things, really. Student financial aid payments would halt. And then really importantly, funding for K-12 public schools and revenue sharing payments to local governments from the state would both be suspended. I mean, those are some economic impacts right there.
And in case you didn't think this was a real thing, Michigan's 48,000 state government workers were notified earlier this month that they could be temporarily laid off if the budget isn't enacted by October 1st. And that's the first day of the state's next fiscal year. So the notice has gone out. This is a real possibility.
Good times. They were, I saw on Twitter that the House was voting on the Republican, approved bills, budget bills today. But there's a lot of skepticism that they're going to meet with Governor Whitmer's agreement, because there are some big cuts to the Secretary of State's office and I think the AG's office and other places and stuff. So it's not expected that these are all going to meet with her approval. We'll see what happens. I mean, you heard Ballard say he was fairly optimistic that they'll be able to avoid it, at least for a long shutdown. So hopefully he's right.
I will put a pin in this here. We still don't have a roads deal. And people who see the construction out there and think the roads are getting fixed, that's not the case. For the most part, they're being patched, and those patches are going to break again. We're not doing comprehensive fixes, even though you're seeing road work happen. It's not the in-depth work that needs to happen.
Right. And they punted on a road deal. Governor Whitmer said that she was not going to sign any budget without a roads deal in place this year. And then she backtracked on that and said, okay, I'll sign a budget without it, but we got to do it eventually. But not happening this year. Okay, that'll do it for today, friends. If you like what you're hearing, tell your friends about Daily Detroit. And don't forget to subscribe to us wherever fine podcasts are downloaded. I'm Sven Gustafson.
And I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other. We'll see you around Detroit.